Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Paul Lockhart. Paul is a professor of history at Wright State University and is a multiple award-winning military historian. Today we're going to talk about his latest book, which is called Firepower: How Weapons Shaped Warfare. Welcome, Paul, to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. Honored to be here.
First off, I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed Firepower, and it's actually quite a long book, but it's incredibly readable. And I don't know how long it took me to finish it, but only 2 or 3 days. And you manage not only tons of really interesting bits of information, but also sort of at the higher level, just quite often you unlock for me, some of these sort of aha moments. That's how it works underneath the surface. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. That's a huge compliment. I appreciate that. So that's what I hope to do.
One thing I just wanted to ask before we get going is that as I read the book, and I really was enjoying it enormously, but it was almost my enjoyment was making me feel a bit uneasy, because this is a book about weapons and war and killing people in large numbers, and of course larger and larger numbers as we get to the modern era. And does that aspect of it bother you when you write and study this kind of history?
This book was actually very difficult to write. I enjoyed it, but this book was very difficult to write. And in part, that was because it wasn't about people per se.
Yeah.
It was more about things. I'm used to writing about people. And it was, as you point out, I was writing about things that kill people. And of course, there were moments where I had to step away. I remember very clearly going through a German technical, it was a military medical work from the 1890s. It was detailing the effects of high velocity rifle rounds on the human body and how this differed from earlier black powder rifles, with lots of graphic photographs of seriously broken people. I had to put everything away for a day. I mean, it was important stuff, and it was interesting, but it was also draining. It was just really hard to get through. So yeah, this one reason this book was harder for me to write, not just the volume of the thing, because it's twice as long as anything I've written before, and the topic is, of course, a bigger topic than I've hit before. But it wasn't easy to write, actually. And I know what you mean about the enjoyment and then feeling kind of bad about it.
It's a bit like watching a Quentin Tarantino movie. So I guess your book starts pretty much when gunpowder first arrives in the West, and that comes from China, ultimately, I suppose.
Yes.
And straight off, the first use they put it to is siege warfare. And your view is that the use of siege guns actually changed the nature of the state, at least in the West. Mm-hmm. And so can you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. Well, it changes the nature of the state on several levels. First, there's the one that relates directly to its tactical use, which is that siege guns make the castle obsolete as a form of military architecture, which in turn has a tremendous impact on the status of the warrior nobility of late medieval Europe. At the same time, it also favors larger, more centralized polities or political sources of political authority, like kings, because siege artillery is very, very expensive and to build, to maintain, to feed, let alone to actually use in combat. So yeah, it's one of those things that helps to, I think, concentrate the political and military power in the hands of larger political figures. In other words, helping to create one of the things that helps to create, I guess, what we might regard as a modern centralized state.
So the small lord who wants to make it too expensive for the king to come and winkle him out, this is no longer possible for him, right?
Certainly not at the same level. The castle can no longer be this mechanism for allowing recalcitrant nobles to resist royal authority with impunity.
But castles, or maybe not castles, but certainly fortifications, they do make a comeback, don't they? And the siege, I'm sort of thinking, there's one in particular, which is the siege of Malta, mm-hmm. where the Ottomans are sort of stopped in their tracks. And I found that quite puzzling. I know there was a key fort there that was kind of one of these star-shaped, I think they're called Tres Italienne
Yes.
type fortresses. But then I'm thinking they also have the town to defend, which presumably has walls, and I don't know quite how they manage that. But there is this kind of seesaw, isn't there, even in the day of the gun between the fortress and the siege gun?
The seesaw is a perfect way of putting it, because it's not as if siege guns appear and all of a sudden fortresses are no longer a viable means of guarding a frontier. The fortress transforms along with the introduction of artillery, so that now the successful fortifications like the Tres Italienne are designed to be artillery resistant and to mount guns themselves as a means of holding off attackers. So yeah, it's not as if siege warfare in some of the bigger ways completely changes. It will remain really until the 20th century the most common form of hostile encounter between military forces. I mean, sieges are more common than pitched battles, for most of the history of the West. So fortresses, yes, exactly, transform, and they also that works into that notion of the changing state as well, because fortifications, like artillery, cost a lot of money. And they're not a single one-time investment. They have to be constantly maintained. They have to be updated as artillery improves, etc.
So your point, I guess, is that, the day of a feudal lord with limited resources, he can put up a castle, but he can't put up a proper artillery-resistant fortress.
Exactly.
There was a bit in your book, and people often talk about this, the siege of Constantinople, and they make the point about these incredible guns that the Ottoman Turks bring to that.
Right.
But I'm never quite convinced that the guns that they brought there were that significant, because it takes them I think it takes them about 8 weeks to besiege and take Constantinople. I mean, I'm not saying the guns weren't important. I think they were very important because they batter the walls. But the defenders are still holding out, and it's only they're exhausted, but there's a piece of very bad luck for them, which is that the key defensive part, they've locked the gate. And so the emperor and the key man running the defense, a Genoese general or admiral or something like that, he's in charge and he's running the defense, and they're resisting pretty successfully. And then in another part of the city, they've left a small gate open, and the Turks get inside, one of these postern gates.
Right.
And they put up a Turkish flag, and then they're pushed out. But the people inside sort of the main defensive part where the emperor is and this Genoese leader is, they see this, and people are very confused and concerned. And then the Genoese admiral or leader, he's wounded very badly. And they're all locked inside this sort of mini fortress. And the emperor decides to let the guy leave because he's asked, I need to leave, I need to go to the boat. And he decides to let him leave. And at that point, the Genoese and the other defenders, they see this and they start to panic because, the Turkish flag's gone up somewhere else and okay, it's come down now, but now the leader is leaving and there's panic and the Turks begin to break in because now the defenders are thinned out. So right. I don't know if they would have held out or not. Certainly not in the long run, and maybe not even in the siege. But if they could have held out just another couple of weeks, after 8 weeks, siege armies get weaker and weaker and weaker. So,
yeah, and more demoralized, and yeah.
One of the things that happens quite early on, isn't it, is they start putting guns on boats.
Yeah.
And you talk about something called the ship-killing ship. And in fact, one of the bloodiest battles, I think one of the bloodiest battles in history, right up to World War I, it may even be the most bloody battle in history, is the Battle of Lepanto.
Yeah.
Because I think some 70,000 people are killed on that day.
Oh, that toll is, it's pretty remarkable.
And that battle was won by guns, but that was just the moment where galleys are beginning to become redundant. So do you want to say a bit about how they put guns on ships and how it moves from galleys into what we would recognize as ship-killing ships?
The fortunate coincidence from a naval point of view, I guess, is that artillery is becoming practical and slightly more portable, especially with the advent of cast iron and cast bronze guns. About the same time that we're seeing significant changes in naval and the technology of naval architecture, maritime technology, with new hull designs and new rigs, especially in Atlantic Europe as opposed to Mediterranean Europe. And the advantage of those ships is they can be built much more heavily. The advantage of those new rigs and new hull designs over galleys is that they can be made to carry large amounts of weight and withstand the kind of shock that comes with firing cannon. Galleys are not really suited to this as well, even though clearly there are efforts to arm galleys with artillery. There is a kind of a hybrid vessel called the galleass that emerges in the 15th century and quite popular in the 16th. But a galley being fairly gracile and shallow draft, meant for the waters of sheltered seas like the Mediterranean or the Baltic, for that matter, don't do well with the kind of massive burdens that artillery requires. Plus, when you have oarsmen taking up both sides of a ship, you don't have the opportunity for mounting guns in broadside. They more or less have to be mounted fore and aft. So with the advent of heavily built sailing vessels like the carrack and then the galleon, the possibility of using ships that are built to carry bulky and heavy cargoes and to mount guns in broadside, so you can stuff a good number of artillery pieces into a ship. Of course, the advantage of that, because galleys are designed primarily for close-up combat. They're designed to ram or to grapple with each other and fight essentially a land battle at sea, where with an artillery carrying warship like a war carrack or a war galleon, you have the opportunity to blast the enemy at a distance. And so the tactical goal of naval combat, with naval combat not being especially common in the Middle Ages, but the tactical goal of naval combat is now no longer to get with the enemy and fight essentially a land battle, but to hold off and blast the enemy to pieces, and hence the ship-killing ship.
And you said, I think, somewhere that the advantage that the Europeans have over the Eastern empires, and I'm thinking about China and India in particular, is not so great. In fact, if anything, you could say that we are behind China. But I'm thinking about the Portuguese. They're quite quickly very successful in the Indian Ocean, aren't they? And is that down to the ship?
Oh, yeah. Those a great deal to that. Just from Vasco da Gama's first voyage his first voyage where he reaches India, it's pretty obvious that the Portuguese have a significant advantage in ship design for naval purposes.
Can we talk about the musket, which you sort of slightly adverted to it at the very start, how the rifle or the musket develops over time and how it revolutionizes the battlefield. And you talk about the Battle of, and I'll probably pronounce this wrong, but the Battle of Bicocca.
Bicocca, yeah.
And how it ended the supremacy of the Swiss mercenaries.
You want me to talk about Bicocca?
Let's just talk about them. There's something called I can't pronounce it right, the
arquebus, yep.
Arquebus. And what's the difference between an arquebus and a musket? Is it the same thing, just a more primitive version?
No, just different size. Arquebus is essentially the ancestor of the modern carbine. I mean, it's meant to be a handier weapon. Muskets are longer and heavier. And in fact, it looks like initially, early muskets, talking about the early 16th century, when we first start to see them, are virtually crew-served weapons. I mean, they're two-man weapons. But even as they are at the time of the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, these are things that are very often in excess of 20 pounds and kind of unwieldy. The advantage of the musket over the arquebus is perceived, and I think has largely been borne out by ballistic experiments, is that a longer barrel generally means greater range and greater accuracy, or marginally greater accuracy at least. So there's the advantage there. But the arquebus is the primary handheld firearm, a primary small arm of infantry for much of the 16th century. So what we see at the Battle of Bicocca in 1522 is the use of the arquebus.
But what is the benefit of the arquebus over a decently trained English archer, say?
Oh, very good question. The longbow is a superior weapon. I mean, there's no doubt about it. In most ways, ballistically, etc., the longbow is a superior weapon. It has a longer range, has a much, much higher rate of fire than an arquebus or a musket. Before the advent of flintlock ignition mechanisms, we're looking at probably an average of about 1 round a minute with a matchlock musket or a matchlock arquebus. So it's fairly slow. Of course, it's hard to call it slow in terms of the 16th century. There's nothing really to compare it to. We're only thinking of it from our perspective. We're used to fully automatic weapons that can shoot several hundred rounds a minute. The longbow is probably greater penetration at reasonably long distances. Two big differences. One of them, the biggest one perhaps, I would argue, is training. And to make a longbowman takes nearly a lifetime of training. And this, of course, from Edward I on, why the use of the longbow is cultivated in England once essentially borrowed from Wales. It really requires constant training to acquire the instincts that allow you to be accurate in a decent, especially without any kind of optics, without any kind of sighting mechanism, to be accurate at a decent range, and to have the upper body and the arm strength to be able to operate a longbow. A musket or an arquebus, the skills can be trained in a matter of minutes. I mean, yes, experience does help with things like accuracy and speed of fire. Those are things you can just take care of with drills, which is one of the more important innovations of the 16th and 17th centuries. But again, an archer takes a lifetime to make. An infantryman with a musketeer or an arquebusier takes hours to make. So there's that. Then also, there is the issue of the noise of weaponry is in itself an asset to those using it, just from a psychological point of view. The smoke, definitely a disadvantage because it tends to obscure the battlefield after a few volleys, but also the nature of the wounds. And that's not to minimize the kind of wounds that a fairly broadhead or bodkin point can do with a longbow, but a soft roughly 1 ounce a sphere of lead hitting a human body does tremendous damage. Among other things, of course, it tends to expand especially upon hitting something relatively hard like ribs. The wounds created by low velocity black powder weapons like the arquebus and the musket are just simply ghastly. So there is that. If they don't kill outright, they tend to disable very quickly.
I guess when the Swiss with their pikes come up against it, I mean, the Swiss at the Battle of Bicocca, as you tell the story, they seem to have behaved very foolishly in that they're actually charging sort of a field fortification. They built a ditch there, so and even when the Swiss get at them, they can't quite get at them, and they're sort of like fish in a barrel to some extent.
And some of that has to do with pride and experience. I mean, the Swiss were justifiably proud of their abilities as mercenaries. For well over a century, they had proven themselves to be practically invincible unless they're up against significant numbers of firearms. So, at Bicocca, even if you discount the arquebus, the damage exacted by the arquebus, there's the artillery. The Spanish have artillery mounted, and the impact, no pun intended, the impact of or maybe fully intended, of a 6 or an 8 or a 9 pounder cannonball, even something relatively small, on a packed square of men is. I mean, we're not talking about high explosions, of course, because explosive artillery ordnance is a much later development, really a 19th century development. So, movies where you see cannonballs exploding in this big cloud of black gasoline smoke is it's essentially wrong for anything before really the middle of the 19th century. But unlike a musket ball, an artillery projectile is not going to stop after it hits one man. And if you're looking at a pike block that's say 50 ranks deep, it's just going to keep going. And besides the numbers of men that it'll take out, the psychological, the blow to morale upon seeing that absolutely ghastly scene must be significant. But again, the Swiss are operating on this notion that they've proven again and again that as long as they kept their cohesion, they were undefeatable. They could overrun anything and they could hold off any kind of attack. It's just that, again, this is a target-rich environment, right? When you have a number of men that are packed into a relatively small area, firearms are going to, or missile weapons in general, are going to be significantly more effective than they would against a more spread out enemy.
And you talk, I think, about the difference between the shock effect of the pike charge, but you get these mixed formations for a while, don't you?
Between pike and musket, because pike does things, or shock weapons like the pike. The pike just happens to be the European favorite, through the 17th century. Has qualities that muskets do not have, and muskets have qualities that pikes do not have. So muskets can, of course, wreak damage from a reasonably long distance. I think 100 yards is good nominal range for that. A little bit more than that, definitely less than that, it'll be more effective. Where the pike, we often forget, especially as we oftentimes point, I think we, meaning students of military history, sometimes denigrate the bayonet as being a sign of essentially a useless weapon in modern warfare. It's something that we see time and time again in the writings of soldiers writing about combat in their day and age, is that there's something especially demoralizing about a body of men moving towards you with sharp, pointy things pointed at your chest or your torso in general. That veteran soldiers can withstand being shot at for a long period of time and still maintain their cohesion, but it's a different thing to be faced by a line of men advancing towards you with really long spears. So the musket at a distance is quite effective, but musketeers can't defend themselves very well. They don't really have any close-up weapons, and the rate of fire, the loading period for a time for a musket, of course, is slow enough. It's difficult, to get that last round in at very short range. Where the pike can defend musketeers when they're being attacked, and itself can provide that offensive push to push the enemy off the ground they're currently defending. So yeah, it becomes, first of all, it's a very effective tactical alliance, but it also demands a lot out of European armies or any army that uses that combination, because to coordinate firepower and shock so they work well together requires constant training, and the tactics are reasonably complex. They have to be, and that's why when drill makes its reappearance in the West, being revived from Roman days at the beginning of the 17th century, why it's so vastly important. It makes it possible to coordinate pike and musket. It also makes it possible for armies to be more flexible, so they can change formation in the middle of battle. And finally, it also helps to increase the rate of fire of small arms like the musket and the arquebus, because that's beginning to see as a critical thing. The amount of firepower that you can generate in any one given period of time very often can be the difference between defeat and victory. And that recognition is really emerging, in the 16th and 17th centuries.
What is the rate of fire of a musket, and does it change over time? Is there technological?
Yes, it does, and it all has to do with ignition. The way that the main charge inside the barrel, the main powder charge inside the barrel is ignited, because well into the 17th century, practically up to the 18th, the predominant form of musket was a so-called matchlock, or used matchlock ignition, which essentially requires pulling a trigger, lowering a length of slow match, which is essentially cord, usually very often hemp, that has been saturated in a saltpeter solution. So it burns slowly and steadily and forms a nice coal. Basically pulling a trigger and descending, making descend a piece of slow match into a pan of priming powder right next to the barrel. And then if that goes off, in theory, a flame goes through a vent hole next to the pan into the barrel, ignites the main charge. It's remarkably reliable, but having fired matchlock weapons for a long time, I can tell you that it's oftentimes not reliable. And this is the main type of ignition system we see in the English Civil War, for example. The musketeers of that period used this, but the flintlock not only is more reliable, especially the variety of flintlock we refer to as the French lock. The flintlock is not only more reliable, but we're probably looking at a threefold increase in the rate of fire. So from roughly 1 round a minute to roughly 3. And while 3 sounds very low, it's 3 times 1. It
seems like a lot if you're walking towards some people who could fire at 1 round a minute, and now they can fire at 3 rounds a minute. That's a very material difference. But why is one faster than the other? I don't quite understand.
The matchlock is kind of clumsy, and it requires a fair amount of checking to make sure things are going to work. The match has to be blown so there's not too much ash on the tip. It's put into a rotating arm called a serpentine or a cock. It has to be put in that arm at just the right angle so that when you pull the trigger, the match actually descends into the pan of priming powder. So it has extra steps besides pouring powder and ball down the barrel and ramming it down, testing to make sure everything's right, and then firing. And failure rate and the reliability rate on a matchlock is definitely not as, it doesn't match with a flintlock. Flintlocks are more reliable. With a flintlock, you have a piece of flint in a striking hammer, or also called a cock, that hits against a piece of steel we call frizzen, that rotates up and exposes the powder just as the sparks are descending into it. The ignition is faster. It's easier to load. There are other advantages too. Like, first of all, you don't have a burning piece of rope in your hand all the time, which when you're carrying black powder on your person is kind of it should be unnerving. And you're not worried about that. Also, with a flintlock, it's reasonably weatherproof in the sense that the weapon is loaded, the priming powder is covered, and perhaps most importantly, and this has a huge impact on violent crime using firearms. Matchlock requires so much preparation, you just can't pull a matchlock pistol out of a holster and use it. You have to have somebody cooperate for a few seconds while you get it ready. Or a flintlock can be ready to go, and all you have to do is bring the hammer back to full cock, and it can be fired. It allows you to carry a weapon that can be kept loaded while it's on you and fired instantly when you want to. But you can imagine, not only the impact on warfare, but also the impact on things like armed robbery. It makes armed robbery possible in a way that wasn't really possible with firearms before. So really, it's just that, it is in every way, shape, and form, it's a superior form of ignition. And while that sounds like a really trivial, technological detail, it changes the infantry firefight. It changes so much about warfare, and mostly it's that significant uptick in the volume of fire that the individual soldier can generate.
With a musket, as I understand it, you put the powder down the barrel and then the ball follows. Right. So when does it change from being the ball goes down the barrel?
Well, breech loading existed. It existed for a long time. Hunting weapons, for example, that are breech loaders. In artillery, early artillery is more breech loading than muzzle loading. The muzzle loading weapons were actually better because they were structurally more sound, and you could use a heavier powder charge and a heavier projectile. The difficulty in breech loading, we see a flurry, for example, of breech loading mechanisms appearing right with the Industrial Revolution, right at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th centuries, and primarily in Britain, the United States, France, in particular. Lots of patents for breech loading weapons, and some of them are reasonably workable. The American Hall rifle, for example, is a good example of that. A fairly decent breech loading military weapon as early as 1819. The problem with breech loaders is, several problems. They're more, from a military point of view, they're much more expensive than muzzle loaders. They're more complicated. It's more, it takes more skill to build one. They are more delicate and require more repair more often, and issues like that. But the really big one is that there's no way with a breech loader from before the advent of the metallic cased cartridge that you can effectively seal off gas leakage. Because if you have metal on metal, which is the way most breech mechanisms work, eventually that metal wears, and eventually gaps appear, and hot gas shoots out right towards your face if you're the guy shooting it. The needle rifle, the needle gun that the Prussians used, their secret weapon in the Austrian War in 1866. While it had a really high rate of fire, it was observed that soldiers very often fired from the hip because they didn't want to get their faces burned. So it's not a matter of just discovering breech loaders in the 19th century, but rather they just don't seem that practical. But with the advent of cased ammunition, when you have powder and ball, and usually also the primer, the thing that sets off the powder, encased in a metal case, it changes everything. I mean, this is one of the key developments in the history of firearms technology, because not only does it make ammunition more durable, not only does it make it far more weatherproof, it allows you to have an instant gas check. So in a breech loading weapon, that metallic case acts as the thing that prevents gas leakage. And without that kind of rigid ammunition, it wouldn't be possible to have repeaters. Magazines had repeaters, or, of course, even more obviously, the machine gun. That's what really makes a difference. So it's very quickly that transition from muzzleloader to breech loader in armies happens right between about 1850 and 1870. Even though most European and most Western armies have adopted this thing called the rifle musket in the 1850s, in America, I think its fame is a bit more prominent because of its role in the American Civil War. American Civil War armies carried rifle muskets for the most part, but within a couple of years of the American Civil War, almost every army in the West has adopted a breech loader using metallic case cartridges.
And when you say a musket rifle, would you mean a traditional musket, but with rifling so that the accuracy is greater?
Pretty much. You see, because muskets, as we talk about them in the 18th century, are muskets almost by definition are smoothbore. They do not have rifling grooves in the barrel, and therefore they're not as accurate, obviously, as a rifled weapon, but they're faster to load. That's one reason that we stick with them. In a musket, you don't have to have that tight contact between the bullet and the inside of the bore. You can have a big gap that we call windage. That makes it easier to load, especially as you fire more and the barrel fouls up and it becomes constricted. Rifles require a tight fit, and when you have a muzzle loader, when you're pushing the bullet from the muzzle to the breech, that tight fit can be difficult. So especially in the 1830s and 1840s, we see experiments primarily in France, Belgium, Britain, and the United States with trying to find ways of having a bullet expand after you load it. So a rifle bullet in a rifle that is smaller than the caliber of the rifle, so it will load relatively easily, but it expands after that.
How do you mean it expands after? You mean as you fire it?
Yes. Now, initial experiments with so-called manual deformed bullets, a way, in other words, of basically smashing the bullet against a pillar or against a shoulder so it squashes, because it's lead, and so therefore soft. But those always prove to be unsatisfactory because you can't smash a bullet uniformly. It's going to be squashed more to one side than the other. The British Army adopts a German design called the Brunswick, which was a belted ball. I mean, you have two groove rifling in the rifle and a ball that looks like Saturn. That is marginally more accurate than a smoothbore, but not by much. And reports I've read from British riflemen said that just the shriek of the bullet as it flew overhead was unnerving from this weirdly shaped bullet. But the design ultimately is an expanding bullet that has a hollow base, and therefore the expanding gases of the powder as it deflagrates, as it ignites, moves into that hollow space and spreads out the so-called skirts of the bullet evenly, so they take the rifling. The most famous, probably the French design named after Captain Minier, usually referred to as the mini ball. And you adopted in British English as the mini musket, the Enfield pattern of 1851 used in the Crimean War. So it has the accuracy of a rifle, but the speed of loading of a smoothbore musket. And so hence the term rifle musket. It's a rifle, but it's musket length.
And can we go back a bit? At least I think we're going back a bit. I wanted to sort of hear a bit about something called the military revolution. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I thought that was an interesting idea in the book. So could you just talk about that a bit?
Sure. It's interesting because fads and theories in history change, relatively quickly. The whole idea of a military revolution was first introduced by Michael Roberts, a British historian who was at that point in the early 50s taking a position at the University of Belfast. His specialty was Swedish history, Gustavus Adolphus and early modern Sweden. He gave this wonderful inaugural lecture of what he noticed when looking at Sweden in the 16th and 17th centuries, which was a correlation between military technology, military tactics, army organization, and the development of the state. And that idea is still, and again, that was almost 70 years ago now that he formulated that. 70 years later, that concept is still accepted. There's a lot of debate about it, but to the point that military historians refer to revolutions in military affairs as something we see fairly often. And Roberts' idea, it involves some themes that we've been talking about here. at the same time that we have the introduction of gunpowder firearms, so a major change in military technology, we also have a change in tactics, which favors infantry, favors foot troops over the traditional heavy armored cavalry of medieval armies, chivalry. And as a result, especially if you combine that with firearms, we're looking at a much different way of war that favors professionalism, that favors larger and better trained armies. And so we see this burgeoning size of military institutions. And at the same time with navies and fortifications, too, all points we brought up before. There's essentially a constant arms race going on in Europe from the early 16th century as the major and lesser states of Europe seek to engage essentially in something they saw as existential, or an existential matter, making sure that your navy was at least of an adequate size and sophistication to take on enemies and potential enemies.
So how does that change the nature of the state then? Because I can see the military is changing, the demands of the military are changing. So how does that change the state itself?
Because these were not burdens that medieval states had to put up with at the same way that they would in the 16th and 17th century. So if you add on to that the fact that European states starting around 1500 or a little bit before are now engaged in interstate conflict on a regular basis, which isn't really very common in the Middle Ages. And then on top of that, the extra complicating factor of the Protestant Reformations, which add a whole new element to interstate rivalry. And so we see this unprecedentedly intense and crowded period of wars from I think Jeffrey Parker estimated something like between 1500 and 1700, there's a total of 24 months of peace in Europe. It's almost continual warfare. And so the state, which had never really had to deal with the burden of not just fighting wars all the time, but maintaining armies and navies to be ready to fight wars, becomes increasingly a mechanism for getting ready for war. The state emerges in that way, the modern bureaucratic state that becomes increasingly intrusive into people's lives, especially as we see the transition to states whose incomes are based on taxation. In other words, the end product of this is for the most part, is a strong centralized state that has essentially a monopoly over the use of organized violence and is being forced to develop mechanisms to mobilize resources, whether that's gunpowder manufacture, or iron, or naval stores of various kinds, or humans. The state emerges as a much more powerful entity because of the demands of warfare, which are, again, they're unprecedented. For much of Europe, that means a move towards absolute monarchy, but even in states that do not ultimately move towards absolute monarchy, England, of course, being a great example, it's still towards a strong centralized authority, even if it's not specifically a monarch. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. You were just talking about things getting bigger and bigger. There's an interesting tension because you got the French Revolution comes along. Mm-hmm. And in that, you get a massive army because they have this conscription. And I'm not quite sure why they're able to conscript in a way that others aren't. But at the time of the revolution, you have bigger and bigger armies. But at the same time, presumably they're less well trained. Yes. And I don't quite understand why the French revolutionary armies aren't sort of swept aside by the better trained, you would assume, the better trained armies of their opponents.
Well, in a lot of ways, they definitely do have disadvantages. I mean, among other things, not just the lack of training, but the inability of the new revolutionary government to keep up with musket manufacture. I mean, it is unable to really keep the revolutionary armies supplied. Now, that's a huge topic in itself. But suffice it to say that the French revolutionary armies had the advantage, of course, of mass, of enthusiasm, based on nationalistic fervor, for the most part. But also some very good leadership. Napoleon just being one example of that. But also some very clever mechanisms like combining new conscripts with troops of the old royal army to kind of bring the conscripts up to speed a little bit faster, and at the same time overall give a greater strength to the army and evenly. So clearly the lack of training and the initial shortages in weapons are huge disadvantages. But you can't argue with the numbers, and because the notion here is not just conscription. The Swedes have been doing conscription for a couple of centuries by that point. It's the whole notion of the nation in arms. That everybody, essentially, that to me that's one of the most important things to come out of the French Revolution, is the notion that in a republic, the difference between a citizen and a subject. The citizen has certain freedoms, and citizen has a stake in society, but the citizen also owes a blood debt payable on demand to the state, and that's not just men of military age. So the French levée en masse in 1793 clearly lays it out that everybody has to take part. Men and women and children have to roll bandages and sew uniforms and make cartridges, and old men have to preach the hatred of tyranny and allegiance to the republic, and the young men of military age go out and fight. Huge landmark moment, and of course, looking forward towards the First World War and thoroughgoing mobilization of all resources for war. That's kind of significant. It's probably getting away from what you asked.
No. It's interesting. It is extremely interesting. Can we just move on to talk about artillery a bit? Because
sure.
I was very taken. I read a theory about the Battle of Waterloo, which is that the French cavalry charge was mistimed because somebody was inching forward and somebody else was inching forward, and then they mistook it and thought that it was the time to charge.
Right.
But what they'd failed to do was to have the artillery, the sort of mobile artillery brought forward to help sort of break up the British squares.
Right.
And the idea was that you don't charge until the squares have been broken up with the artillery. So can you just talk a bit about artillery on the battlefield? Because at first, artillery on the battlefield, it's pretty difficult, isn't it? Because getting these things moved is so hard.
Well, yeah, and that's a lot of an issue is simply that, is the issue of transport. The kind of bombards we see in late medieval, early modern siege warfare are they're not meant to be moved easily, and once they're put in place, they stay there for a while. It's quite a while. It's not like nobody has the idea of artillery as anti-personnel weapons. In other words, weapons directly to kill people as opposed to weapons to knock down buildings. It's just that the metallurgy is very much against it. The quality of metallurgy definitely, the sophistication of European metallurgy definitely increases dramatically in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And as it does so, it becomes possible to make cannon that are of a large enough caliber to be more effective than a musket, but small enough so that they could be, carried on a limber, dragged behind a limber with, 6 or 8 horses. And therefore relatively mobile. And it really is not until, we see field artillery being used in the 30 Years' War quite a bit. It's not especially mobile. And one of the difficulties about using it, one reason the commanders very often are reluctant to, is that, it pretty much has to be put in place before battle. You're preparing for battle the night before, you put it in place. And once it's there, it's there. If the battle moves in an unanticipated way,
you've got no artillery.
Yeah, and if there's if a sudden precipitous retreat is called for, the guns are gone. They're too difficult to drag off, and they're really expensive, so you don't want to lose them. And also a mark of honor, just like losing standards. So it's really not until the 18th century that we see viable field artillery. Field artillery meant to be used on the field of battle. And then, even then, initially relatively small 4-pounders and 6-pounders, meaning that's the weight of the shot that they throw. And it's not very, a 6-pounder ball is nominally about 3 2/3 inches in diameter, so it's not huge. But with that extra mobility, there's a possibility of not only having artillery that can be moved about as situations warrant, but by the middle of the 18th century, by the time of the 7 Years' War, the possibility of horse artillery. Meaning here I mean that all gutters, all personnel are mounted or they're riding on caissons or limbers. So in other words, artillery that can move at the speed of cavalry. And if sufficiently well drilled, they can put their guns into action within seconds, and they can take their guns out of action within seconds. And that kind of mobility attached to that kind of firepower is a transformative moment. And overall, during the first half of the 19th century, of course, in the French wars and in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, artillery has a very high profile. It's easy to attribute in the French army that to Napoleon being an artillerist. But it's largely a matter of that guns are more easily transportable, and the key armies, the Prussians, the French, the British, the Austrians, all put a fair amount of weight on artillery. The next step is going to be what happens in the late 19th century when you put together breech loading technologies, self-contained ammunition, new propellants, new explosives, and ways of suppressing recoil, and you put all those things together really within about 30 years, in the last third of the 19th century.
It is incredible, the period from 1870 up to 1900. The rate of change it just changes completely. It goes parabolic.
Well, there's nothing like it. I mean, and I think relatively speaking, it's hard to see a change in actual weapons. A rapidity of change that even equals that, and especially looking at the before and the after. You compare an army in 1860 to an army in 1900 in terms of their potential lethality there's no comparison.
The Industrial Revolution, I don't know when you would put that in the late 1700s, and the Industrial Revolution makes different types of weapon systems possible because you can start to precision, you mass produce things which are moderately precise at least. And it's quite interesting. You give a few examples about the Confederates in the Civil War, and they're much more primitive in terms of the Industrial Revolution really hasn't come to the South.
And of course they're heavily dependent upon imports from Europe, which actually ended up by the middle of the war, the proportion of for example, Confederate infantry armed with British or Austrian rifle muskets that are, up to date is pretty high. But again, these are being imported. Oddly, Confederate industry becomes reasonably sophisticated in the last year of the war, and the Confederate been not as much in weapons production as in other things like uniforms. But it's too late to make much of a difference in lacking a robust transportation network. It's almost irrelevant.
One thing I noticed is that the Confederates do occasionally seem to make up for their sort of lack of sophistication with some quite ingenious ideas. So they have this armored ship, which initially at least is quite successful.
Oh, the Virginia, yeah. Very often people know as the Merrimack because of the of course it was built off of the charred remains of a U.S. Navy frigate that had been burned at Norfolk at the beginning of the war. Oh yeah, it's a genius. Of course, it's not very long ago before northern shipyards can turn out far superior armored warships in much less time. But yeah, the improvisational nature of the Confederate war efforts really is fascinating.
And they also had, didn't they? They had one of the first submarines.
Yeah. The first submarine to actually sink a ship.
But unfortunately, their torpedo was sort of stuck at the end of a long stick, as I understand it.
Yeah, like what we call a spar torpedo. Without a means of propulsion, that's essentially it. And spar torpedoes are used a fair amount during the Civil War and after the Civil War in the smaller European conflicts. But they're inherently dangerous to the user as much as to the target. And the indications from the Hunley, which of course has been recovered from Charleston Harbor quite a few years ago, is that it appears that the spar torpedo is what did in the Hunley, what killed its crew, very likely almost instantaneously.
Sticking a torpedo on the end of a long stick is probably not the way to go.
Don't try this at home, right?
Okay, so let's think. Time's going by, so let's think where to move next. I mean, we could talk about. Well, I was thinking about this technology going into overdrive, and everybody patents everything. And I was thinking, if I was the state, there's no way I'd let my inventors patent stuff because patents are public, aren't they? And this extraordinary thing where technology is being exchanged between the French always seem to be ahead in the technology race, but only for a year, and then everybody catches up.
Everybody catches up. Yeah. It's remarkably compact arms race. Nobody ever seems to have an advantage for very long. And of course, one of the most famous and although very typical example is the HMS Dreadnought, which when it first is launched in 1912, it's 1906. It's just simply, there's nothing like it. It just immediately makes every other kind of capital ship obsolete. And then by the time of the First World War, it's already a couple generations behind. That's why it doesn't really see significant service in the First World War. The British have already moved on from that. And it's incredibly wasteful. It's difficult to imagine. I mean, the kind of thing I love to study is the loss in social capital as a result. I mean, the fact that European states are redesigning their weapons systems, and not just redesigning them, but making them in gigantic quantities, only to have them made obsolete within a couple of years and have to go through the whole process again. And this is a point too where most European states are becoming a little bit more involved in social welfare programs that had not been part of the burden of government in the 19th century, earlier in the 19th century. It's incredibly wasteful, and just imagine the amount of surplus that's generated from this, the surplus weaponry. This is really where we begin to see military surplus weaponry as being an issue in the West.
You mentioned the Dreadnought and the Great British Fleet during the First World War. I thought you were very unfair to the British fleet in your book. You said a couple of times something like, for the most part, the Dreadnoughts accomplished very little in the Great War. And then you say, for all their cost and technical sophistication, the great ships had done very little. And I thought, well, the British fleet did great things, which is to say that if they would not have been there, Britain would have lost the war, presumably in an afternoon.
Well, you understand, first of all, I wasn't referring specifically to Britain there. I was referring to all the fleets. My point is largely the kind of things that dreadnoughts were designed for, and the super dreadnoughts that followed them. They were designed with the intention of carrying on line of battle fleet on fleet conflicts. And how much did they do that? There's Jutland and Dogger Bank. I mean, there's so little actual fleet action that the things that the huge capital ships did accomplish in the First World War could have been accomplished by smaller and less costly weapons. And here too, I'm comparing the investment in terms of time and resources to the actual results, and the amount that the great powers poured into naval construction before the First World War is simply obscene, and yet they don't really. There's no evidence, there's no significant evidence that they really contribute all that much. Again, to say it's different to say that I'm not talking about the navies in general. Navies obviously accomplish a great deal in terms of convoy escorting and supporting amphibious operations like those in the Dardanelles in 1915. But the dreadnoughts specifically don't really change naval warfare significantly.
Right. But I mean, I would argue that pretty much every military power wastes, huge amounts of effort and money in producing these ships, with the exception of the British, because the British are on an island. So, if anybody else outcompetes them, they're finished.
Right. And of course, there was great reason to be concerned about that. Especially after the response to the launching of the Dreadnought, and more important, perhaps more specifically, rather, the creation of a German imperial fleet, which had only been a problem since 1871. So it's quite a new threat and a very frightening one from a British point of view.
Absolutely, and yet for the Germans, it turns out to be a massive waste of their resources. They would have been better putting it all into submarines or.
Which is, of course, one of the big lessons coming from the First World War at sea, is submarines don't cost that much to make, as long as you don't mind losing a fair number of crews on a regular basis. Submarines for what they cost are more effective, more efficient, and they destroy more enemy shipping per dollar cost than any other kind of warship in the war.
The submarine is sort of one of the emblems of World War One. So that war in the North Atlantic,
right?
And then you have the machine gun is another great emblem of the First World War. But you make the point that actually, in terms of sheer killing power, it's the artillery that is everything. And I guess one of the reasons they can do that is now they've got the shells that can explode in midair, or explode indeed on impact. And that's something that they couldn't do initially. Initially, it was just a big round metal ball, wasn't it?
Yes. There's a major evolution going on in artillery ammunition. It really threw, in a significant way, through the beginning of the 19th century. The most common artillery round is a cannonball, what's called solid shot. There are anti-personnel loads that mostly involve using multiple projectiles, like grape shot or canister. So they have multiple balls, essentially turning the cannon into a shotgun, but very short range. And explosive shell has been around for quite some time, but it presents, in a muzzle-loading cannon, it presents difficulties because there has to be a way of igniting the shell. And in mortars, short-barreled weapons, it's possible to actually light the shell fuse before you fire the gun. But what happens if the gun fails to fire? If there's a misfire, you still have a shell due to explode, right in front of you. And in a longer-barreled weapon, making sure with a round ball, this is very difficult to do, that the fuse is pointed in the right direction. You don't want to have the fuse pointed towards the main charge. The main charge is just going to blow the fuse into the shell and likely result in an instantaneous explosion inside the barrel. So, there's all sorts of issues here. By the early 19th century, some of those are being resolved. A French naval engineer named Payson designed, in fact, a naval shell gun, as he called it, a huge built-up cannon designed to fire shell at relatively high velocities so they could penetrate ships outside timbers and explode inside. That the fuse problem is solved by making sure the shell is mounted to a sabot or a sabot, basically a kind of a plate that keeps the ball from rolling when you load it. So the position is fixed. And if the fuse is actually pointed away from the explosion, that works fine. There's enough flame that moves around to ignite the fuse. So we see explosive shell being used in the Crimean War, in the Franco-Austrian War, and the American Civil War. But part of the problem, one of the reasons it's not all that effective is black powder itself. And you understand that, up until the last third of the 19th century, black powder is the all-purpose military explosive and propellant. Is used and those are two very different things, very different tasks. Forcing a bullet or a projectile out of a barrel as a propellant, as opposed to killing via blast or by fragmentation. Black powder did both. So in the late 19th century, we see the development, because this is where chemistry as an academic discipline flourishes, and where governments begin to take control over their scientific communities, where they begin to harness academia in particular for helping with technological innovation. So we have the advent of high explosives, TNT, first patent in 1863 being the first, but there's a whole succession after that, and they're so much more powerful than black powder, and they're so much less volatile. Most of them are, at least, than black powder, and so now a shell doesn't require a lot of explosive. And it sounds like a ridiculous detail, but black powder would, because it's not a very powerful explosive, you'd have to pack a fair amount into a shell in order to make that shell capable of killing beyond a very, very narrow radius. The problem, of course, is that the shell has to have thick enough walls so that when the gun goes off, the shell doesn't collapse in on itself. So you have to have fairly thick iron walls in a cast iron shell. But now with high explosive, you don't need as much explosive, and we've got cast steel, which is a little bit more resilient. you can pack a lot more of explosive force into a much smaller projectile. This is what makes it almost ridiculous to have a 6-pounder shell back in the black powder days, because you couldn't put enough powder in it to really make it worthwhile. So high explosive means that even without counting fragmentation, just the blast is capable of not just killing, of just destroying troops within a reasonably large radius of the explosion. And that's why the increase in lethality of artillery between 1870 and 1914 is just it's mind-boggling. And on top of that, rate of fire and accuracy and range all increase almost exponentially in the period after 1870. So you combine those things together, the killing power of the individual projectile plus a rate of fire that increases almost 5 to 10-fold, much greater accuracy, and the ability, because of the French innovation of recoil suppression, where you can have an artillery piece pointed at a target and it'll stay on target. It doesn't have to be re-aimed with every shot. Artillery is by far the deadliest weapon on the battlefield.
And yet, when you have the Battle of the Somme, I think the British believe that their artillery is going to be enough to suppress the German defences, to destroy the German defences, and
Yes.
that their attack can burst through, and it really doesn't turn out like that. And I think you're quite sympathetic to the generals of World War I and the problems that they face.
Well, one thing I've seen is common in I think in Anglo-American historiography of the First World War. I think it's common throughout the First World War, especially. I think overall military historians tend to be sympathetic to the enlisted men and not terribly sympathetic towards generals. And most of the time, I fully understand that. I do have a problem with the whole lions led by donkeys perception of the war. Understanding that while some weapons, and the First World War really has been, recent British scholars like Nick Lloyd and Paddy Griffith have really done a lot to change our understanding of the First World War. Generals were not as ignorant of the new weaponry as we tend to think they were. The machine gun was quite familiar to professional soldiers. Some of the weapons we associate with the First World War weren't as deadly as we think they are. Poison gas being a great example. Poison gas is almost tactically insignificant in the First World War. It just makes the war more miserable. And it's why we remember Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen's view of the war so well because of the horrors, but they don't necessarily have much of a tactical impact. But with the real problem that First World War generals face, more than anything else, is scale. The size of armies in the First World War there's nothing like it in European warfare before. So citizen armies, half trained, wielding the new technology. I think that European generals perfectly understood that modern artillery and modern small arms, especially the machine gun, made it difficult to conduct frontal assaults without preparation. And that the model that was possible 70 years before, for example, the Franco-Austrian War, where the French found that you could assault prepared enemy positions as long as you move fast, really, really fast. That's not possible anymore. And so what we see in the First World War, I would argue, is not so much a matter of, I've been called on the carpet about this particular point with this particular book, that we have incompetent generals not understanding what machine guns will do to human bodies, but rather generals who don't have much of an opportunity to experiment with new tactics, desperately trying to find a way to restore mobility and maneuver to warfare, desperately trying to find a way to break through enemy trenches. And they don't have the luxury of having field maneuvers in peacetime to try to find tactical alternatives. They have to experiment with their own men. And it's sad, but they don't have a lot of choice. And I think with the Somme we see, this, I think the assumption from earlier experiences was that saturating the enemy with artillery fire is going to be enough to at least neutralize resistance in that area long enough to send infantry in. Of course, it doesn't work that way. My thought with the Somme is that not so much a matter of the incompetence of generals, although there clearly is some of that. Most of it's not having any other means to find out that saturation bombardment doesn't really work. That it doesn't that it doesn't destroy barbed wire obstacles, that it doesn't kill all the defenders, that some of the defenders emerge from their bomb proofs unscathed, maybe slightly deafened, but unscathed, and are able to put their Maxim guns back to work, and that in fact saturation artillery bombardments just destroy no man's land and make it difficult for the infantry to move forward because of all the shell craters. And I think, Paddy Griffith, I think, demonstrated this after the Somme. The British did indeed work very hard to find alternatives to this. But I think the Somme was kind of a tragic experiment. But it is part of this experiment in trying to restore mobility to warfare. It's just that I think in the end, the solutions that really work well are not the ones that involve blasting the hell out of the enemy with artillery fire. They involve a certain amount of stealth and rely on specially trained troops and mostly on infantry, so-called stormtrooper tactics of the last year of the war.
Can you just say a bit about the stormtrooper tactics? Because I always find that little bit of it is slightly glossed over in the history books that I read, in that you'd say, oh, well, it was unsuccessful and it ran out of steam, and then... And
of course, that's one of the strategic issues there's multiple schools of thought about how to conduct an infantry assault in the First World War. There's a notion of walking fire, for example, the marching fire. The French and the Germans both experiment with that relatively early on.
What is marching fire, sorry?
Well, you have to have infantry who are all armed or primarily armed with high rate of fire weapons, like light machine guns. This is before the advent of the machine pistol and the submachine gun. So if you have the troops all armed with semi-automatic rifles or light machine guns, that they can fire while they're moving. In other words, they can suppress the enemy, not necessarily kill them, but suppress the enemy until the point that they're practically on top of the trench. It's a neat idea. It just never really seems to work all that well. And there's a whole issue of finding enough fully automatic weapons to supply your troops with. Stormtrooper tactics, probably the best examples come from the Russians and from the Germans. The Russians in the Brusilov offensive the summer of 1916 did use artillery, but relied more on infantry. And one of the things that was obvious coming from the Somme was that when you bombard the enemy a lot, as the British did at the Somme, the enemy has a pretty good idea where you're going to attack. Because you're just giving it away by bombarding it. So you be prepared for it. The Brusilov in 1916, understood that was probably a liability. Also understood that short, random duration bombardments were more effective at sowing confusion among the enemy, and of course that helps a great deal. Brusilov's, I think, main contribution, and so the reason why his ideas are unpalatable to the Russian High Command, is that Brusilov departs from one of the most common maxims in Napoleonic warfare, which is that not only that you always attack, you always go on the attack, but you attack the strong points. You attack the strong points, and the weak points will collapse. Just hammer at them, and of course this is one of those legacies of the Napoleonic age that unfortunately was still pretty much at every general's head. So what Brusilov suggested was bypass the strong points, cordon them off, leave them alone, hit the weak points, infiltrate them, and then keep moving. And eventually the strong points will be isolated. And you can send in heavy infantry later to do that. But the initial infiltration is done by specially trained assault troops with close action weapons. Rifles, obviously, but lots of grenades and pistols and knives and trench clubs. In other words, they by stealth, they infiltrate enemy trenches, and then as they punch through, they keep moving. Of course, the Brusilov offensive was massively successful until you can't sustain it anymore. Because eventually the troops outrun their supplies and they're exhausted, no matter how successful they are.
Yes, they have this new tactic, don't they? I don't know who develops it, but this idea of you bite and hold, which is to say, you make small advances and then you
hold on to them tightly. Yeah. And the German tactics, so-called Hutier tactics, and sometimes called stormtrooper tactics, are very similar, but with a little bit more complicated elements to them, including, for example, bombardment that doesn't focus on the front lines. Instead of focusing on the front lines, focus on communications trenches and headquarters and communications networks. In other words, do everything to sow confusion behind the front lines. And then you also do the infiltration tactics that the Russians were doing. The Germans, however, what relatively minor thing, but the Germans not only using large numbers of grenades and other close-up weapons, this is where they first start using the first practical submachine gun, the MP-18, which was a weapon in search of a purpose at that point. Nobody really saw a reason for having essentially a big pistol that was fully automatic, but in the context of trench warfare, it was made for that.
And the other weapon that you would think would give rise to mobility, but you are very much down on, is Winston Churchill. I think he's one of the two inventors of the tank.
Oh, yeah.
But I think you say it really doesn't do much.
It doesn't do much, but, that's why I categorize it in the book as an emerging technology. It obviously, in retrospect, it's obviously worth investing money and time and resources in. And fortunately, there were a few people, and mostly in Britain, who understood there was some potential there, even if it wasn't quite realized in 1916, 17, and 18. And in the U.S., it was Patton and Eisenhower. In Germany, of course, Guderian and others. But the British are obviously those who invest the most in the tank. It's just that while, again, it's one of those weapons, like poison gas, if you took it out of the First World War, would the First World War end any differently? I don't think it would. The couple of tank battles we have are interesting. I don't think their presence in the last 100 days of the war, while interesting, I don't think it makes it any more or less likely that the Allies are going to overrun the Germans in the last few weeks. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that, again, a great idea, but one, the individual technologies that made up the weapon were not advanced enough. And here I'm thinking primarily of motors and transmissions. We're just simply not up to yet the point where they could push a truly heavily armored fighting vehicle at a decent rate and not break down in no man's land. And, that's really the issue. But again, all that, we see that in the 20s and the 30s especially, that the wisdom behind the tank coming out as automotive technology catches up to military technology.
And then in the Second World War, it becomes the symbol of the Second World War.
Oh, yeah. And clearly, you can't take armor out of the Second World War and have it look anything like it actually did. Where in the First World War, it's different. The other emerging technology, of course, in the First World War is air power. But I don't think, if you took air power out of the First World War, it wouldn't look anything like it did. It might well have ended differently. Who knows?
What is the key role because I can see that air power is helpful, particularly for reconnaissance, I guess. That's really its contribution. I mean, other roles for aircraft are definitely experimented with, and a lot is gleaned from that. For example, the possibilities for using fighter aircraft, pursuit aircraft, definitely explored. Again, not really having any bearing on the outcome of the war, except that I think that the fighter aces became something of a boost to morale in all the participant nations that had significant air forces. The other experimental roles, strategic bombing, which is primarily an area where the Germans excel, although. I think the lessons coming from strategic bombing in the First World War are kind of mixed. That it's certainly not enough of a volume to break British morale, both by whether it's bombing from Zeppelins or from the large Gotha heavy bombers. In fact, it just really seems to just tick people off and make them more resolved, which is something we run into again in the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War too. But the real contribution, as you mentioned, is reconnaissance and especially artillery spotting. The virtues of modern artillery in the First World War, or the potential of artillery in the First World War, is realized in large part because of the tactic of indirect fire, of artillery crews firing on targets that are not visible to the artillery crews. They're not firing something at line of sight. The Japanese demonstrate the wisdom of this in the Russo-Japanese War without air power. But once you have the possibility of sending crews up aloft, particularly if they have a way of communicating with the ground other than landing
and meeting them personally, the fact that you can have the information on enemy positions as the battle unfolds and relate it back to some kind of centralized aiming facility, and then have the word spread to individual artillery batteries. The effect on the actual tactical use of artillery is dramatic.
Are they able to do that? Do they have wireless at that time?
Eventually, yes. Towards the end of the war, that becomes more and more commonplace. But yeah, this is the real contribution, I think, of aviation in the First World War. Another one that's being explored towards the end of the war is what we call close support or ground attack. Again, an area where the Germans tend to pioneer, of using aircraft actually to hit ground targets in battle. In other words, coordinating artillery or coordinating aircraft with infantry, for example, which is again something that will be much more commonplace in the Second World War. In fact, a vital part of air power in the Second World War.
And air power is a huge thing in the Second World War, and yet I'm thinking about the bombing campaign. Certainly, the bombing of Britain doesn't change much, except it just doesn't. The bombing of Germany, I guess it achieves more,
yes.
and their production does continue to rise throughout the war, but presumably they can do a lot less than they would otherwise have been able to do, absent the bombing campaign.
Right.
In Japan, when they start to bomb the mainland, I mean, it's horrific. The firebombing of Tokyo, for example. When I read about the firebombing of Tokyo, it's very difficult, the Japanese war, because you feel so much that they brought a lot of this on themselves, and yet the tactics that were used against them, the firebombing, was absolutely horrific. And I was just looking on Twitter the other day, and they were talking about the murder of American airmen towards the end of the war. It was extremely unpleasant stuff. But then you thought, if you were in Japan and entire cities were being set on fire and all the civilians were being incinerated, you start to get into some sort of a moral quagmire, don't you?
Oh yeah. And there's something. Here's the whole atmosphere of the Pacific War is different from that in Europe. My dad was a Pacific War vet, and it was interesting. Of course, he was also a very, very introspective man, and he understood, the role of propaganda in terms of demonizing the Japanese. But I remember him pointing out to me that as a young man in the service, he thought of Germans as human. He didn't think of Japanese as human, and that was, of course, a lot of that was stuff that was spoon-fed to American GIs and American sailors. But yeah, by the standards of the Second World War, it's a very, very brutal war. Of course, it's easy to justify that brutality if you're the one, if you're responding to an aggressive move by that enemy, but yeah, there's something about the bombing of mainland Japan that is really disturbing.
Hmm. Well, look, maybe we just end it there, because the war does seem to get more and more depressing as you move through time, and you end your book with an epilogue with the atomic bomb being dropped on Japan, and I would like to say an end being brought to military history, but that's fanciful. And as we
I had mixed thoughts about ending the book there. I told myself first when I was doing this that I wasn't going to get past the Second World War, and part of that is just my own personal proclivity. I used to joke with my dad about this fact that I had a hard time as a kid thinking of World War II as being history because my dad was in it, and that couldn't possibly be historical. So my grandfather was in the First World War, but I was still distant enough. But to me it's not as if firearms, and clearly the focus is firearms. I mean, a lot of associated technologies, but it always gets back to firearms. And whether it's dealing with tanks or aircraft, I'm looking at them as weapons carrying platforms more than anything else. And after the Second World War, clearly firearms are no longer really the central focus of research and weapons development. And while there are still remarkable developments going on in small arms technology, a lot of them revolving around optics, especially, that it's still not the same kind of pace of development that we saw after 1870. where everything about the weapon is dramatically transformed. So to me, that was 1945 was kind of a good point to end it, because the focus of military technology is just moving in a different direction.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because there are points in your book where nothing really changes. Things get better, but nothing really changes for, maybe even 100 years. And then there's other things where, the existence of a cannon that can knock down a castle wall, that changes everything. Being able to put cannons on boats, that changes things. And the mass armies, that changes things. And your point about drill, there's these sort of inflection points. But
yes.
And then in 1870, which I guess is, I sort of see that as the war to start all wars. It's the wars of revenge start there with the Germans win then, and then each war that ends in a revenge match. But that period from 1870 to 1900, just everything changes. And then after that, as you say, after 1945. Nothing much is changing, really. It's just the same, only a bit worse.
Yeah. And in some areas, of course, I mean, for example, in aviation, things are changing dramatically. It's just that at the time I thought it was kind of beyond the scope. But I'm so used to, as a historian, I'm so used to covering things in a kind of an even pace, and I've usually dealt with much shorter narratives. And so the pace wasn't really a big concern. But as I was writing this, is something I knew I was going to encounter when I got to that point, which is, when we look at war through the history of war through the lens of military technology, and we get to an age that, as military historians, we think as being a major inflection point, the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon. And when it comes to military technology, not that much happens, really. I mean, in thinking about it, the wars of Napoleon are essentially fought with the hardware that Frederick the Great used. It's really not significantly different. The size of the armies are different. The approach to war is different. The notion of the nation in arms is different, but the tools are the same. And in some ways, as I like to point out, for example, the musket. Musket changes superficially from 1500 to about 1860 or so, but by and large, it's a tube on a piece of wood that's lit from the muzzle, uses black powder, it doesn't change in terms of performance, except that one change from basically 1 round a minute to 3 rounds a minute. It's still a musket, and it's right. Then of course we get to the middle of the 19th century, and boom, the technology takes off.
I was interested that your dad was in the Second World War. My father was in the artillery. He was.
Really?
He was in the British artillery.
What did he go in, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm trying to remember, but I think he was certainly across at D-Day. I think he may have been in the desert,
Okay.
but he was certainly there at D-Day, and he thought about it very little. He may even have been in Germany, but approaching Germany. He was certainly part of the British Army that liberated Belsen.
Okay.
And he also tells a story of being somewhere in a city, sort of shelling forward, as you say, indirect fire, and there was some elderly gentleman turned up on a bicycle and started to lift their ammunition and throw it in the canal. That was about it. I think somebody took a shot at him and he sort of pedaled off on his bicycle. And my grandfather, he was in the trenches. He was in the Scots Guards. He was a Highlander, and he was in the trenches and very definitely had no wish to talk about it at all.
Oh yeah.
And to somebody of my age, I was 8 or so when I was talking to him about it. But
my dad was actually Navy. Went in young. I mean, he was 17 at the time. This was in '44. It was made clear to him that as soon as he turned 18, he would be drafted, whether he liked it or not. And he would have turned 18 before he graduated from high school. So his principal arranged it so he could graduate a year early. And my grandmother kind of pushed him towards the Navy because his older brother was already in the Navy, and he was repairing flying boats at Pensacola Naval Air Station. He had a pretty good Second World War. My dad was immediately put on an attack cargo ship and was at Okinawa. But he would not talk to say a thing to me about the war. except mentioning a couple friends he had made, until I don't think I was like 18, and I was watching Victory at Sea. And it just happened to be the one on the kamikaze offensive at Okinawa. My dad just sat down and was completely glassy-eyed, because they were, in fact, I was reading this in their war history, the USS Oberon had one kamikaze kill to its credit. My dad was there. His shell hoist had broken down. He was carrying 40 millimeter rounds by hand to the one of the gun pods on the deck. And he said, right as this Japanese dive bomber was coming at their starboard side, and they knocked it down about 200 meters shy of the ship. And then he goes, I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life. And then he'd talk about it a bit more after that. But, Pacific vets in particular, I think of American vets, Pacific vets are usually the ones who are less willing to talk, especially if they were infantry or Marines.
Yeah. The main thing my father would talk about the war was the fact that he was, I think he was 1 year into Oxford when and of course he never went back, and he was always quite bitter about that. That was his dream, had been to get to Oxford University, and this was then taken away from him. So he never really forgot that. That was a matter of some bitterness. Anyway, thank you so much for today, Paul, and thank you for being so generous with your time. That was really kind of you.
It was fun. It was fun. It really was. Okay,
well, I don't know. I'm quite interested in what you said about the Swedish stuff, and I must get hold of. I don't know. Is your book are they more academic? Because
yeah, but I've always tried to make things accessible. It's one reason I ended up doing trade books. It just was frustrating to write monographs. But I've always tried to make them so they were accessible. It's just that right now in academic books you have to have a chapter on the historiography, and which when I started writing trade books, it was so liberating that I could just write narrative for the sake of narrative. But yeah, I've done 3 books on early modern Denmark. One in the Denmark.
That maybe explains some of the stories you have in your book about the Danish and the Germans meeting, and that of slightly appalling battle.
It was fun to be able to put some Danish history into that. And I did a book on 17th century Sweden. And I'm working on a Danish book right now, and thinking about doing one on the new Sweden colony in North America. But that's been kind of my academic field. But obviously, Scandinavian history isn't something that resonates with a lot of Americans. And
I must admit, I'm very ignorant of it, except I know that the Swedish nation was incredibly successful as an imperial power for some period of time. I don't think it was a hugely long
time. It wasn't. The lack of resources kind of...
you run out of men eventually, don't you?
Yeah.
I guess. Okay, well, look, thanks again. And that was great.
Thanks, Russell. Appreciate it.
Well, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then I have a big favor to ask. I don't look to make any money from the podcast. There's no advertising or anything like that. I just do this because I enjoy speaking to the guests, and I'm keen for them to get as big a audience as possible, because I think they are really, really good people. So if you could share it on whatever social media channel you use, tweet it out, whatever it is. And even better, if you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, goodbye for now.